Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Hi, everybody. This is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit Beth Avram Yosef for webyeshiva.org, a platform of Torah and Torah inspiration from Eretz Yisrael. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and we are in the middle of section 2, chapter 29, which is quite a lengthy chapter. And so we're dividing it into two parts. Um, the Rambam is committed to the concept of eternity a parte post. That was a phrase that we were exposed to from the Shlomo Pine's translation of the guide, which is dividing eternity into two parts. There's past eternity and there's future eternity. The Rambam has proven or maintained that it is necessary for a Jew to believe in a concept called creation, that at one point the world as we know it did not exist, and then it came into existence by God's volition. But once God created a universe, it, by virtue of the fact that God is perfect, everything that emanates from him, the creations that he emanates, must by definition be perfect. Something which is perfect, by definition, exists for all eternity. So, whereas the Rambam does not subscribe to belief of a parte ante, which is an eternity going all the way back in time because he believes in creation, nonetheless, he believes in eternity a parte post, that once God created a perfect universe, it must, due to its perfection, exist for all eternity. The Rambam also maintained the same about human souls, that souls were created at the time of creation, but will exist for all of eternity. And that he says that eternal existence of the soul is what the Rambam had called Olam Haba, the world to come. The first half that we spent on chapter 29 was a discussion of various parts of Tanakh which seem to contradict that idea. There seems to be a suggestion by many passages in the prophets that indeed the world will at some point come to an end, that things will dramatically change. There will be shifts, a new world order, and then eventually non-existence. And this is a challenge for the Rambam's model of an eternal creation moving forward into the future. And therefore, the Rambam went to great extents and to used a tremendous amount of verbiage to explain to us that we should not understand those verses literally. They are all meant figuratively. Whenever something dramatic happens to a society, the prophets, especially the prophet Isaiah, will sometimes use terminology that implies the stars will fall from heaven and the earth will shake. It's not literally meant that way, but rather it'll be very impactful to the people who are undergoing it. But in reality, there will be no scientific change to the laws of nature at all. Now, we are at a point in our discussion, we're at the very bottom of page 344 in the Pines edition, top of page 345. That's where we left off last time. And the topic of conversation that the Rambam is now getting into is the topic of miracles. The Rambam had quoted a statement from the sages that everything that God created, including the new world order, how the world will exist in the future, in the Messianic age, was also created at the time of creation. So that there is a future world, it seems, dramatically different from our world, that when God created all of existence, he created that as well, and it exists in a different plane of reality that we have not yet experienced. And at some point in the future, that new existence will come to the fore, and that we will experience that. The Rambam says that seems to be a challenge to our idea, and he really is referring to the way Reb Saadia Gaon, who is one of his medieval predecessors, understood it, that the world will essentially change at some point in the future in the Messianic age. But the Rambam says that I do not at all understand the words of the sages that way. And at the top of page 345, for it is possible that he means that, in other words, the words of this sage mean that the nature that will necessitate in time the states of existence that have been promised is created since the 6 days of the beginning, 6 days of creation. In other words, it's true that there will be a new world order, but it will not essentially change the laws of science. And that whatever God put into motion at the time of creation, it was with the anticipation of all future events taking place, including miraculous phenomena, which is what the Rambam is going to go into. Now, just as an introduction, the Rambam is a miracle minimalist. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, we started off by explaining that for the Rambam, anything which is perfect must by definition be consistent and exist for all of eternity. It doesn't change. Change is a sign, using Aristotelian science, anything that changes is flawed, is imperfect. Something which is perfect is static and unchanging in its perfection. And therefore, the question becomes, why would there be a new world order that would essentially change the laws of nature if everything that emanates from God already is perfect? This leads the Rambam to the belief that there will be no essential change to the world order for all of eternity, including into the Messianic age, this great age that is described by the prophets, when glorious things will occur. And there are implications in the passages that things will essentially change in nature. The Rambam will tell us that we are misinterpreting those verses. It will be a very glorious time of peace and prosperity, but nothing in nature will essentially change. Now, that also brings the question of, well, what do miracles mean then? What is this phenomenon of a miracle where there are changes in natural science? How can that be if everything that God created already is perfect? How can there be alterations and changes to those laws of science? And so this is going to lead the Rambam to be a minimalist in explaining miraculous phenomena. And what I want to do is I want to bring up the handout that I have for today, which is going to, we're going to see that this is a theme that is brought up in a number of the writings of the Rambam in different places. And so we're going to see a lot of cross-referencing here today. Let me just see here. Let me share my handout. This handout is readily available if you don't see it on your screen. It is readily available on the Facebook group or community Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and it is also available on webyeshiva.org in the course description for today's Shiur on Moreh Nevukhim, Part 2, Chapter 29, Part 2. Now, the Rambam, as we're going to see, harbors two opinions about the nature of miracles in order to explain them in light of the perfection and eternality of creation. First of all, his own opinion is, and he says this in the first paragraph on page 345, he says, I have said that a thing does not change its nature in such a way that the change is permanent, merely in order to be cautious with regard to the miracles. In other words, the Rambam's contention is miracles have occurred throughout history, and we believe in miracles that will occur sometime in the future based on portents of the various prophets. However, the difference between the change that occurs in a miracle and the change that I feel is not possible is that a change that occurs as a result of a miracle, like the splitting of the Red Sea, is a temporary departure from the laws of nature. It's not a permanent departure. And the reason why that's necessary to say is because everything as it exists currently is perfect. Why would you change that which is perfect? And as a result, if there is going to be a miraculous phenomenon, it's going to be very temporary, after which time everything will go back to its normal, natural, and perfect state. And therefore, the Rambam minimizes the impact of miracles, that they are localized to specific populations and specific times in order to induce awe within the population that is witness to that miracle, but not in order to essentially change the laws of nature. And then after that, and that, like the Rambam says, for although the rod was turned into a serpent, the water into blood and the pure and noble hand became white. These are all miracles that God showed to Moses when instructing him to take the Jews out of Egypt. These and similar things were not permanent and did not become another nature. But as they, may their memory be blessed, the world goes its customary world, the customary way. The world goes according to its minhag, according to its regular trajectory. This is my opinion, and this is what ought to be believed. But then the Rambam doesn't stop there. The Rambam then says that we're going to look at a pronouncement of the sages, which is made in a number of places, where they say something very strange, or dvarim temuhim ma'od, very bizarre or very strange. Now, what the Rambam is introducing, according to some commentaries, it's possible that the Rambam doesn't even believe or subscribe to this idea of the sages, but I don't think that's true. I think the Rambam is saying that the rabbis were very sensitive to the idea of perfection, and this was their way of dealing with miracles being a departure from that perfect state of nature. He says the opinion of the sages is that every miracle was embedded within nature at the time of creation. And what you gain from that is that when God created a perfect universe, embedded within that creation was sort of like putting miracles on a timer. And that God created, for example, the earth that would open up and swallow Korach and his men. God created that hole in the earth, but put it on a timer that it would open up precisely when Korach and his men were situated there, and Moses pronounced that a miracle would happen. And this is, even though the Rambam does not cite this, but this is something that he talks about in his Mishnah commentary in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers. He mentions it in his introduction to Pirkei Avot, but he also mentions it in particular in this statement of the sages in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot. And they state as follows. I'm just reading it from the handout. And we're doing a pause in our text of the Moreh Nevukhim for just a moment. Asara dvarim nivru be'erev Shabbat bein hashmashot. There were 10 things that were created in the twilight hour at the very end of Friday of the first 6 days of creation. And the last things that were created before God rested on the Sabbath were the following 10 things. And the Mishnah lists, ve'elohein pi haaretz, the hole in the earth that opened to swallow Korach, Upiha Be'er, the mouth of the well. There was a miraculous rock that flowed forth water for 40 years for the Jews in the desert. Piha Aton, the mouth of the donkey that spoke to Bilam. God created that donkey on some plane of existence and caused that it would sort of putting it into motion that donkey would speak thousands of years after the period of creation. The Hakeshet and the rainbow that would emerge after the flood. The Haman and the manna, etc., etc. We're not going to go through all this. This is a fascinating Mishnah, but that's not our objective today. Now, in his commentary, the Rambam writes, at least a portion of his commentary states as follows: Kevar zacharti lach beperak hashmini shehem lo ya'aminu b'chidush haratzon eight achar eight. That I've already explained to you in the 8th chapter of my 8 introductory chapters to Pirkei Avot, known as the Shmona Prakim, that the rabbis did not believe that God would change his mind on the fly after he had already created a perfect universe. Again, very consistent with what we're learning in chapter 29 here. Ela shebereshit asiyat hadvarim husam b'tiv'am sheye'aseh bahem kol ma sheye'aseh. But rather, the rabbis believe that when God first created everything at the moment of creation, that God embedded within nature everything that would eventually emerge over the course of time. Bein shehaya hadavar asher ye'aseh tadir v'hu hadavar hativi, ubein shehaya li'itim rechokot v'hu hamofet. And that's true both of phenomena that occur on a constant basis, which we call nature, like the rising of the sun every morning in the eastern horizon, or whether it's miraculous phenomena, which is something that happens only on a one-time basis. There is no difference between the two other than that the former occurs regularly and the latter occurs only rarely or only one time, but they were both set into motion at the time of creation. ולפיכך אמר שביום השישי הוא שם בארץ שתשקע בכורח ועדתו. That's the reason why the Mishnah states that on the sixth day of creation, God already put into motion that the earth would open up its mouth. ובאר שתוציא המים, ובאתון שתדבר וכן השער. And that the well should bring forth its water miraculously, that the donkey should speak, and all of the others as well in this list. We skip a little bit in this commentary, and he asks the question, B'shema tomar, v'im hamoftim kulam husamu b'tiv'ei otam hadvarim misheshit yimei bereshit. If everything that would emerge miraculously over the course of time was set into motion at the time of creation, lama yuchadu eila ha'asara, then why are only these 10 singled out? What about all of the other miracles that do not appear in this Mishnah, such as the splitting of the Red Sea? So the Rambam's answer is as follows. I want you to know, shehem lo yuchadu lomar she'ein sham mofet shuhusam b'teva hadvarim misheshit yimei bereshit zulat eila. The implication of this Mishnah is not that these are the only miracles that were put into motion at the time of creation. Ella amar she'ela bilvad haita asiyam ben hashmashot. But it's rather to say that these 10, this list of 10 items in the Mishnah, these were created at the very end of the sixth day of creation on that Friday, Erev Shabbos, going into Shabbat. But ushar hamofetim omnam husmu b'teva hadavar asher naasubo bereshit asoto. But all of the other miracles that were set into motion at the time of creation, those miracles were not set into motion at the end of the sixth day, but rather when the initial item that would manifest the miracle was created. Limashal, amar ki bayom hasheni be'ete chalkut hamayim husam b'tivam sheyibaka yamsuf lemoshe. And for example, when did God split the waters and make way for dry land? That's on the second day of creation. And if so, or rather, split the waters between the upper waters and the lower waters and created a firmament in between. That was on the second day of creation, where God manipulates the water for the first time. If so, that manipulation of splitting the water on the second day of creation also was the time that God created the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea, another manipulation of splitting water. V'hayardein lihoshua, and that's when God caused the splitting of the Jordan River for Joshua. V'chein le'Eliyahu ve'Elisha, and also for Eliyahu and Elisha, who also did similar miracles with water. Uvayom harivi'i keshenivra'a hashemesh usam ba shetamod bizman ploni b'ma'amar Yehoshua. And similarly, on the fourth day of creation, when the sun was put into motion, God created the miraculous phenomenon of the sun that would stand still in the times of Joshua in Giv'on, when he fought a war and required the sun to stay in the sky a little bit longer. V'chein sha'ar hamofetim chutz me'ela ha'asara v'heim husmu b'teva otam hadvarim bein hashmashot. The only thing that is unique or special about this list of 10 in Pirkei Avot is that these miraculous phenomena were created specifically at the end of the sixth day for reasons which we won't go into now. But that's the Rambam's contention, and it is completely consistent with the midrash that the Rambam quotes at the end of this paragraph, which is that Rabbi Jonathan said, and we have this for you in the Hebrew, Amar, it's actually Rabbi Yochanan in our text, Tana'in itna hakadosh baruch hu im hayam sheyehi nikra lifnei Yisrael. That God created sort of a condition, or he put into motion at the very inception of the creation of water, or at the manipulation of water at the time of creation, that it would eventually split for the sake of the Jewish people. And the only thing the reason why we call it a miracle, as the Rambam writes in the middle of the paragraph, he put it into these natures that all the miracles that occurred would be produced in them at the time when they occurred. According to this opinion, the sign of a prophet consists in God's making known to him the time when he must make his proclamation, and thereupon a certain thing is affected according to what was put into its nature when first it received its particular impress. So that's the whole contention of the Rambam. We now understand why the Rambam is also of the opinion, now that we see that the Rambam is a miracle minimalist because he believes in the perfection of the world, we can also understand why the Rambam takes sides in a dispute that appears in the Talmud as to what will occur in the Messianic age. Now, there is one opinion in the Talmud that suggests that there will be essential changes to nature. And it takes the words of the prophets quite literally that when the Messiah comes, the lamb will lie down with the lion and so forth. And there will be essential changes not only in the human nature, but in the animal kingdom. And there will be some kind of dramatic alteration of the laws of nature. But the Rambam takes the side of the other sage, the sage known as Shmuel, who says in the Talmud that the only thing that will essentially change in the Messianic age is in the political realm, that the world will experience peace, there will be no tyrannical regimes, the world will be ruled over by King Messiah, at least the Jewish people will, and everyone will be living in peace. And the Rambam mentions this a couple of times in the Mishneh Torah. The place where he says it most explicitly is in the Laws of Tshuva, chapter 9. And he says, V'sof kol haschar kulo v'hatova ha'achrona she'en la hefsek b'giraon. He says, the ultimate reward, which will come to man that is eternal, hu chaye ha'olam haba. That is the world of the life to come. And if you recall, which we learned a couple of chapters ago, a couple of weeks ago, the Rambam maintains that the world to come is purely for the spirit and not for the body. Okay, and we talked a little bit about the challenge that many people had for the Rambam based on Talmudic passages that imply that it is a communion of body and soul. Rambam rejects that idea. Aval yemot hamashiach hu ha'olam hazeh. He says, but the Messianic age is this world, and it's va'olam kemin hago holech, quoting that Talmudic passage that the Rambam mentioned in Moreh Nevukhim also, the world will go according to its current trajectory and nature. Ela shahamalchut tachzor liYisrael. Only thing that will change is that the monarchy will be restored to the Jewish people. Uchavar amru chachamim harishonim, as our sages already said. He's quoting one sage, but he calls it the chachamim because he wants to sort of bolster this opinion. Ein bein ha'olam hazeh liyemot hamashiach ela shi'abud malchuyot bilvad. That the only difference between the Messianic age and today is the subjugation of tyranny. And that will come to an end. There will be world peace, and the Jewish people will be under their own rule instead of being subjugated to somewhat foreign king's rule, foreign government's rule. Now, the Rambam says this even more explicitly in this Igeret Tchiyat HaMetim, in his epistle on resurrection, where, if you recall, we mentioned this a few weeks ago, the Rambam's position on Olam Haba was challenged even during his lifetime by some of his contemporaries who felt that the Rambam was committing on some level an act of heresy by suggesting that the world to come would be devoid of body and would be by spirit alone. And in the course of that, of trying to defend his position, the Rambam also has to explain that his belief is that nothing will essentially change in the state of our current nature in this world, in Olam Hazeh. He says, "V'chein histapek alehem amorenu shema'amar Yeshaya v'gar ze'evim keves v'gomer shuhu mashal." He says, many people have expressed doubt to my suggestion that when the prophet Isaiah says that the wolf will lie down with the lamb is only allegorical, metaphorical. It's not to be taken literally. V'zeh lo anachnu levad amaruhu, ela kvar kadmuhu lahavanat zeh ha'inyan anshei ha'tfuna min ha'meforshim. He says, what are you attacking me alone? Many of the other meforshim say that it's purely allegorical. Kamo Rabbi Moshe ibn Tatala, v'ibn Bel'am, v'zulatam min ha'meforshim. He says there are a number of commentaries which we're not going to make reference to today, but he says But the Sofa Devarim Yoreh Alav, he says, but if you look carefully at the passages in Isaiah, you'll see how the verses themselves are indicative of this. V'hu omro lo yareu v'lo yashchitu b'chol har kadshi, because the prophet, in the same breath of saying that the wolf will lie down with the lamb, says that they will not commit evil, nor they will be destructive in my mount of holiness, in the Temple Mount, ki mala'ah haaretz da'at Hashem, because the world at that time will be filled with a greater sense of knowledge and understanding. Hine kvar natan ha'ila biotam az bilti chomsim v'lo mazikim lefi shehem yedu et Hashem. He says that the world is not going to essentially change. The nature of man will not essentially change, but rather the world will be filled with greater enlightenment. And as a result of their greater enlightenment, they will not be violent anymore. There'll be an end to warfare, something that we thought we would have seen by now in our lifetime in the 21st century, but we certainly headed in that direction. Hatiru atem kahal Yisrael. He says, can't you see, oh, my fellow Jews, my fellow brothers and sisters, mi sheyesh lo seichel, sheyeh mitzaer ha'aryeh bizmanenu, ze mamreh v'lazehu torev. He says, think about the lion. You know what a lion is in our times. It is a rebellious creature. It is a ferocious creature. Va'az yashuv v'yedami bor'o ma shetzarich. Do you really legitimately think that a lion is ever going to fully comprehend what it needs to understand and change its nature, change its stripes, so to speak? And will it really know that it's wrong to be ferocious and to be an injurious creature? It'll change essentially from being a carnivore and to start eating straw instead, to become a herbivore. And he quotes a pasuk that he actually quoted earlier in this chapter. If you remember this from last week's discussion, he says that many of the words of the prophets are cryptic because they speak mysteriously and in metaphor. We've already explained this extensively in our work, The Guide. And we've also explained in the Mishnah Torah that it's quite clear to us Sheyemot HaMashiach ein bo davar mishinui seder bereshit, that in the Messianic age, nothing will essentially change. But now we understand the philosophical underpinnings of why the Rambam is so strongly adheres to this belief. It's because he believes in eternity, a parte post, which means that nothing can really depart from the perfection of what is in today's laws of nature. Let us continue now on with page 346. And we'll just read the first paragraph where the Rambam summarizes his point about eternity a parte post, and at the same time summarizes his rejection of Aristotle's a parte ante. The matter has now become clear to you, and the doctrine epitomized. Namely, we agree with Aristotle with regard to one half of his opinion, and we believe that what exists is eternal a parte post and will last forever, with that nature which he may be exalted as willed, that nothing in it will be changed in any respect unless it be in some particular of it miraculously, although he may be exalted, has the power to change the whole of it or to annihilate any nature in it that he wills. It's not that we're denying God the ability to change or to annihilate, but rather we say that by virtue of its perfection, God will not tamper with it. So, and God will also perhaps bring temporary miracles. That's okay. We're also allowing for that as well. However, that which exists has had a beginning, and at first nothing at all existed except God. His wisdom required that he should bring creation into existence at the time when he did do it, and that what he has brought into existence should never be annihilated, nor any of its natures changed, except in certain particulars that he willed to change, i.e., referring to miracles. About some of these we know, whereas about others that will be changed in the future, we do not know. We're waiting for future miracles as well. But Rambam basically does not explain why God chose to create the world at the time that he did. That's a part of the mystery of all of existence, why God decided at one point to bring creation into existence. But the Rambam is a scientist, and once God has created a perfect existence, it will never change. This is our opinion and the basis of our Torah. Remember, we talked about the theological, doctrinal underpinnings of believing in creation, and that's what leads him to rejecting Aristotle. He says Aristotle, on the other hand, thinks that just as the world is eternal a parte post and will not pass away, it is also eternal a parte ante and has not been produced. Now, we have already said and explained that this doctrine can be arranged in a coherent way only through a recourse to the law of necessity. In other words, if you believe in an eternity, a parte ante, that eternity that goes back in time all the way, you also must believe that God is not a volitional God. God does not will things, but rather he emanates by necessity. And that's an unacceptable doctrine of God that we simply cannot accept. And that necessity contains a presumptuous assertion with regard to the deity, as we have explained. And I refer you back to chapter 22 of this section on page 319 in the Pines edition, where the Rambam discussed this extensively. Now, before we finish this chapter, the Rambam has two preambles to the next chapter. Chapter 30 is also a lengthy chapter, but it gets really into the meat of the whole objective of Moreh Nevukhim, as per what the Rambam explained in his introduction to Moreh Nevukhim. The Rambam said that we have two very important subjects that we would like to exposit upon in the guide. One is Ma'aseh Bereshit, the act of creation, and the other one is Ma'aseh Merkava, the act of the chariot. The Rambam will defer discussing the act of the chariot, what he calls Aristotelian metaphysics, and how they are reconciled with the verses in Ezekiel and other prophets. That'll be at the beginning of section 3 of Moreh Nevukhim. But here the Rambam will devote a chapter, a little bit more than a chapter, to his discussion of Ma'aseh Bereshit, the act of creation, that it is necessary for man to at least have some level of comprehension of the laws of nature in order for him to attach himself to God intellectually. You need to understand what God's creation is all about in order to connect with God properly. And so I'm going to use this opportunity, he says, to discuss this with you in chapter 30. That'll be the next chapter. We're going to talk a little bit about Ma'aseh Bereshit and the laws of nature and where you can find them in the words of the Torah and in our sages. But I need to give you two introductory ideas. The first introductory idea says, the Rambam, do not take the words of the Torah and the sages at face value, and only study, accordingly, you should only study Ma'aseh Bereshit after you have properly prepared yourself with a knowledge of science, so that when you do read the prophets, you will be able to understand their words properly, since their words cannot be taken at face value. You need to know the laws of nature. You need to study science in order to really comprehend what the prophets want to tell you. For this reason, the sages cautioned carefully about the study of Ma'aseh Bereshit with the general public. And of course, he's making reference to the Mishnah in Chagiga that we've seen a number of times in studying Moreh Nevukhim, where the Mishnah says that there are certain things that you're not allowed to publicly lecture about in any great depth. So the first thing the Mishnah said is Ein dorshin ba'arayot bishlosha. You're not allowed to talk about sexual laws with three or more people. Nor may you discuss the laws of physics as they pertain to an understanding of the act of creation and how the world was created. You may not discuss that with two or more students. It can only be discussed individually with one student. And then finally, nor can you even share the laws of metaphysics and the act of the chariot as described in Ezekiel and other places. You cannot discuss that with even one student unless that student is exceptional. And the Rambam in his Mishnah commentary says, we've already explained the reason why this is true in the introduction to the Mishnah. And it's because, says the Rambam in his Mishnah commentary, is that most of the general populace really cannot properly understand the story of the narrative of creation and how the world came into existence ex nihilo from nothing, in any real form because they simply don't have the grounding either in Torah study or in scientific study. Ve'enam nimsarim ela me'echad le'echad, and therefore they can only be transferred from teacher to student on an individual basis. V'nizarim bahem ki ma'at me'od yavin bahem ha'hamon. You have to be very careful and selective how you give over this information because the general public cannot really understand it. Ucheshiyishma'em hapeti tishtabesh emunato, and therefore the reason why this is so hazardous is because when a foolish person, an unlettered, illiterate person, hears the ideas that I wish to transmit, or that a person discussing creation wishes to transmit, his faith will be upset. His faith will be disturbed. And he will think that there are certain things that are explained that will be in contradiction with truth. When in reality he is hearing truth, he just doesn't realize it. The Rambam also makes reference, and so therefore he writes, um, uh, uh, this is why the sages were so cautious about revealing these ideas. And the correct thing to do is to refrain, if one lacks all knowledge of the sciences, from considering these texts merely with the imagination. One should not act like the wretched preachers and commentators who think that a knowledge of the interpretation of words is science, just because you know how to explain the words of the story in Genesis does not mean that you truly understand it. And in whose opinion wordiness and length of speech add to perfection, nor is it wisdom just because you know how to use rhetoric properly to explain these ideas. On the other hand, it is obligatory to consider them with what is truly the intellect after one has acquired perfection in the demonstrative sciences and knowledge of the secrets of the prophets. You need both things. You need to know science and you need to know how to understand the Nevi'im. However, as I've explained several times in our commentary on the Mishnah, none of those who know something of it should divulge it. And they say explicitly, this is the quote from Bereshit Rabbah, as from the beginning of the book up to here, the glory of God requires to conceal the thing. What is he referring to? It's a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 9, which we won't go into now due to constraints of time. But Rabbi Levi basically says that the entire first portion of first chapter of Genesis is what we call Kavod Elokim, the glory of God. And as King Solomon writes in Mishlei, Kavod Elokim Haster Davar, that when dealing with the glory of God, you are meant to hide the idea. From that point forward, exposit on it to the public. From Vayichulu Hashemayim V'Haaretz at the beginning of chapter 2 of Genesis, have at it and explain it to your heart's delight and share it with the rest of the world. First chapter of Genesis, be very, very cautious about whom you choose to teach it to because it contains divine secrets and you have to be very selective. Now the Rambam is going to sort of explain to us what impels me to share these ideas in print. If I've already explained that it should only be shared with one student and orally, quietly, what right do I have to share this? He says, and this is a very important passage, inasmuch as the divine commandment necessarily obliges everyone who has obtained a certain perfection to let it overflow toward others. This is a um, very important language that alludes to the whole idea of prophecy. What the Rambam is saying is that once you've gained a certain amount of knowledge in a certain area, you need to be godlike. And just like God overflows his essence in order to be creative and to emanate to the rest of the world, every human being, because he has the directive of imitatio Dei, to imitate God, also has this necessary sort of impulse to overflow his wisdom and to influence the world around him. And I feel that way, says the Rambam, as we shall make clear in the chapters on prophecy that follow. Every man endowed with knowledge who has come to possess an understanding of something pertaining to these secrets, either through his own speculation or through being conducted toward this by a guide, a mentor, must undoubtedly say something. I can't be silent because I would not be true to myself or to my godly spark if I was silent and muzzled myself at this time. I have to overflow my knowledge and share it with others. I will do so with great reservation and only revealing some of the flashes. In other words, as he writes, I will overflow with flashes only, leaving most of the information hidden. And that's what he says in the remainder of this paragraph. Don't think that just because I'm writing a chapter on the topic of Ma'aseh V'Reshit on creation, I'm giving you everything. I'm giving you tiny snips, tiny little flashes of light, which this idea of flashes of light, like in the nighttime in a storm, when you see a bolt of lightning, you get to see reality for just a split second and then everything goes dark again. That's what I'm doing for you, my friends, when I give you this information in my guide. So that's the first preface. Be very careful about studying Maaseh V'Reshit. Appreciate that you have to be extremely well prepared before studying it. And therefore, when I share it with you, I'm only going to be doing it with great reservation. Preface number two, or preamble number two, is that be aware that the prophets use words equivocally, quote, that are not meant to mean what they indicate according to first glance, according to what you would normally think they mean to imply. This is sort of a continuation of what of the first preamble, but here he's very carefully stating that the prophets deliberately select words that are meant to be alliterative and are not meant to be taken literally. And they do so either to conceal the real meaning or because Hebrew lends itself to this kind of elastic manipulation to be able to use one word to imply an idea in the abstract. And so, for example, he brings us three examples of this idea. One is from the book of Yirmiyahu at the very beginning, that God said to me, the prophet Jeremiah, Ma'ata ro'eh Yirmiyahu, what do you see in your vision? Va'omar makel shaked ani ro'eh. I see a speckled rod is what I see in my vision. And what does God say to him? The word shaked, speckled, doesn't just mean shaked, spotted, but it also means shoked, to be hasty. So he says, Ki shoked ani al devari la'asoto. This is a perfect example. You look at the word shaked in the prophet, and either shaked means spotted, or it could mean an almond rod, a branch of an almond tree. But the fact of the matter is, it's not referring to spots. It's not referring to almonds at all. It's referring to the idea of to be shoked is to do something hastily. And so you see that the prophets deliberately choose language that lends itself to multiple interpretations. And they wish to do so in order to obfuscate the reality. And so be very careful when studying the words of Tanakh to appreciate this idea. So the second example that he brings is a passage in Ezekiel chapter 1, where Ezekiel has the vision of the chariot. And again, we said Rambam's not going to get into the act of the chariot until section 3 of the guide. But he uses two words that the words are chashmal, which we translate as electricity or flashes, light flashes. And he also uses the term nefoshet kalal, that in Ezekiel's vision, he sees chashmal in the fire, and he has this vision of the Godhead, of the four creatures that are part of God's chariot, and then he talks about the angels and v'notes etzim, and they give forth light. These angels, ke'ein nechoshet kalal, like sparkling brass or sparkling copper. Now, those terms, says the Rambam, are not at all referring to what they seem to be referring to. As so, for example, the word chashmal, as the Rambam will explain at the beginning of section 3, section 3, chapter 7, the Rambam says that chashmal is a contraction of two words, chash, which means to move quickly, and mal, which means to become stationary or to be cut down, because this idea of movement and stationary implies something that is contradictory, that is contained within one idea. He also talks about the idea, and you can look at the footnotes on page 348 in the Pines edition. The footnote, especially footnote 69, is helpful in helping us understand this idea. It also, chash means to be silent, mal means to speak. That could also be the sort of contradiction of the word that is really what is being implied by the prophet. The word, um, uh, he also explains that in that passage, he has a vision of the foot of a calf. And the word egel is calf, kikaf regel egel. And the word calf really is a reference to something round, referring to the motion of the celestial bodies as part of his vision, but not at all having to do with the calf. But the word agol means circular. The idea of nechoshet kalal, of sparkling copper, is a reference to something completely different, which, like the Malbim explains in his commentary over here, that it refers, the word nachash refers to something that departs from the natural order of this world, which is represented by the word nachash. The point is, which we don't have time to go into right now, is that all of these words are not to be taken literally. The prophets speak literally and allegorically. So this is where, unfortunately, we have to stop. We're way over time. And we'll continue Bezrat Hashem with chapter 30. We may be taking a break over the next week or two, especially because 2 weeks from now, or a little bit less than 2 weeks from now, is Tisha B'Av. So we may be taking a break for a couple of weeks. We'll keep you informed as time goes on. Have a great day, everybody.